Hello ladies and YouTube, and welcome to part 5 of our opening repertoire guide with the move 1e6 as black. So we're going to continue our adventures. Last episode we looked at the advanced variation, and we've already looked at what to do against the Tarrasch and knight c3. Today we're going to be focusing on what is White's, I would say, fourth most popular move, and I would probably say it's the most popular move if you play online. Certainly in a lot of master games you won't see this as often, but certainly online I tend to see this variation the most, and that move is the move E takes on d5. So this is known as the exchange variation. So after black captures, it's pretty much the only move that black can play. Black is, would you believe it, has achieved immediate equality. Positions completely symmetrical, and black has solved one of his main problems. So we've seen in quite a lot of variations this bishop on c8 tends to be hemmed in quite a lot within the pawn structure, but in this particular variation, this bishop is free to roam. Roam free, as free as the wind blows. So yeah, you know, that's pretty good. But this position is, in my opinion, it's one of the hardest positions to play as black if he wants to play for a win, and it's for that reason I actually struggle playing this against this variation when I'm playing as black on the black side, because sometimes I'll try and push a bit too much for a win when actually the position is just totally drawn in a lot of situations. But yeah, you know, with both sides having this symmetrical pawn structure like you can see here, so you know, this completely symmetrical pawn structure, there is no imbalance that you would get in a lot of other variations. So as a result, this position has a very high draw percentage, particularly in sort of grandmaster games. So that's something to just bear in mind. Alright, so we'll continue with the variation. So there's two really big variations out of this. The first one I'm going to show you is, in my opinion, it's sort of less commonly played in when I'm playing online, but you'll probably see it maybe a lot more in maybe tournament play, particularly in grandmaster play. This is seen a bit more, and that's the move 4c4 here. Now with this variation is known as the Monte Carlo exchange. And it's probably the most testing line for black to face. So here white is adopting something similar to, let's say, the Panov-Botvinnik attack that you can see out the Caro-Kanns. I'll just show you what that looks like if I go back just one moment. So the Panov-Botvinnik attack in this sort of exchange, and then c4. But the key difference here is in the Panov-Botvinnik attack, white is exchanging an e-pawn for black's c-pawn, but which, you know, you can argue is not too good for white, in the sense that now he has got this black has achieved this 2-to-1 pawn majority against white, which can be normally much better in the end game. But with the Monte Carlo, if I go back to here, the key advantage here is that you know, there's one pawn versus one pawn here in the center. So in that regard, you could say it's actually an arguably better position than in the Panov-Botvinnik attack. But with that said, there's no real imbalance here unless black takes this pawn on c4. So if he does do that, so let's say he does that immediately, what that gives black is this isolated queen's pawn. And you know, isolated queen's pawn positions are very interesting to look at. Certainly if you're looking into sort of middle game plans, this is a really good pawn structure to learn and what to do against it. But the essential plan really for black is he wants to try and exchange as many pieces as he can when he's playing up against the isolated queen's pawns. He wants to try and exchange all the pieces, because if he can get to an end game, typically this pawn gets much weaker. Its power in the early stages gets much more diminished. Meanwhile for white, so his plan is going to be very much avoid all the pawn exchanges, avoid piece exchanges, I should say, and bank on the early advantages of this pawn in the sense that it gives white a lot of space to develop his pieces very freely, and later in the position, typically actually in the endgame sometimes, this pawn can be quite deadly, as you can see here it's one of the only pass pawns in the position that white has. So that's kind of a brief overview of the Isolated Queen. There's loads of videos online to look at if you want a bit more information of what to do in those particular plans. Right, so in this variation, what I would recommend is just develop normally here. So just get your knight out to defend the pawn. One other way you can play is you could play c6 here as well. The challenge with that is after a couple of exchanges, both players now have an isolated pawn, so you've both got weaknesses here. It's playable. It's looking at the engine, it's going completely zero, just simply due to the fact that there's no. Both players have got a completely symmetrical position, so that's one other way of playing. But I would tend to avoid it if c4 is played here, maybe later in the position. But anywho, so knight to f6, and typically you're going to see the knight come to c3 here now. That's a good square for the knights. So controlling the centre, attacking the pawn, and then I'm going to just recommend b4 here. And really, this is just quite simple development. We just want to get our king castled. It's very, very similar to some of the lines we've already looked at, like the Queen's Gambit declined. Just getting these two really good minor pieces out, and then just getting the king castle to safety immediately. Black could play bishop to g5, so doing a similar plan, which is now threatening to capture here, relinquishing the defense of this, but we don't need to worry so much about that, as now we can just castle, and if this is captured, after this move, if we think we can take this pawn, we can't, as now there's this lovely little tactic here. The idea being, if now white captures this pawn, we've got this lovely fork here, so you can't do that. If they try and capture en passant, that's absolutely fine, as now the knight will be jumping into the square to take that. So just a little trap to little think about there. This is a real good advantage for black now, as he's got all his pieces out. He's going to recapture the pawn. He's going to do very well here. Okay, so going back. So in this position, after castles, once we see this bishop develop, we want to capture this pawn. The reason why is, now if we did a move earlier, let's say they did knight here, and then we capture, white just recaptures straight away, and there's no dramas. But what we're doing here is, after the move bishop to d3, we are capturing here now, so white is having to waste two moves in recapturing this pawn versus just the one straight move that he would have done earlier. So you can see here now, if you compare that position with what we just looked at with the knight here, black is just sort of gaining a move there. So bishop takes on here, and this is really just kind of the main starting position for black. We've got some ideas with throwing in a check on e8, maybe playing the move c5 that the engine's suggesting here. That's not too bad as well. So just getting rid of the isolated pawn, or you can keep it on and maybe play against it if you wanted to. So moves, moves like maybe getting the bishop out to g4 once the knight's developed on f3 is pretty good. Maybe just getting the knights normally out on c6, or playing this sort of little defensive move with c6 is also quite effective as well. So that's just stopping that pawn from advancing immediately later in the position. So it's a little bit of a safety precaution. So yeah, the Monte Carlo, it's still a variation to be very aware of, very careful of. White, black has got maybe a slight edge here, if we look at it on the engine perspective, but as a black player, it can be quite a difficult line to play against, just simply because white just gets so much space in the center here. He's controlling pretty much every square in the center, but black gets adequate counterplay in my opinion, and you know, he's going to get his pieces out now quite nicely and really put a lot of pressure on this d4 pawn. Okay, so that's the Monte Carlo, so not too much to worry about in that variation. Let's go on to our next position. I'm just going to flip the board just a moment here. So the next position in the exchange variation is the move bishop to d3. And if I just remove these arrows just for a minute, the idea of this move is it stops this bishop from developing to this really nice square on f5. So it's quite a sort of positional move, and white's got quite a simple plan here, and white's quite a difficult line to play against. He's going to maybe get his pawn to c3, his bishop to c2, get his knights out at some points. Oh, the knight doesn't go there, and then maybe his bishop coming out to g4. And it's a pretty straightforward setup. White has no weaknesses really in his position. It's not particularly ambitious for white to play this way. He's not going to be, you know, really going for an immediate win, but he can argue that he's playing this way to maybe exhaust black a little bit and maybe try and force black to try and do too much risky things and then win the position that way. But it's very frustrating, and for me anyway, I hate playing against these sort of lines. So against this, what I would recommend to try and play for a little bit of some unbalanced stuff is playing the move knight to c6. What this does immediately is it's attacking this pawn, so white's going to have to react in some way. So typically c3 is played, so defending this pawn. He can play knight to f3, but you know, this is quite good for black, as now he's going to play bishop to g4. And now white's got this quite annoying pin here to the queen, and it can be a little bit tricky to get out of it. If he wants to develop this queen later in the position, he's either going to have to play a bit of a restricting move like knight to d2, or he's going to have to play some weakening moves on the king's side with h3 and g4. So this is quite nice. So if you ever see this knight come to f3, just throw in g4 and really restrict white's plans. So going back then, so after c3, we're now going to play bishop to d6, knight to f3, and here knight g to e2. And this has the idea of protecting white's deployment on f5. So you can see the bishop's going to come over here. And this is a very imbalanced way of playing as black. This is if you really want to kind of play for a win, because what we're going to try and do is get this bishop developed, play the queen to d2, and then look to even castle on the queen side, and then just throw our pawns down here, get our other rook along, and just throw everything at white. Okay, so that's why if after castles, Black can castle here as well. Another idea is you can actually play bishop to g4 here now. After bishop to g5, just play f6 here. And I know it looks really weird playing this move because we're exposing our king's flank, but bear in mind we're not going to be castling on the king's side, so we don't have to worry about this so much. After maybe the bishop going to h4, we're now going to play queen to d7. So I'll just have a look at some of these interesting lines. This has been reached in a few of my games, this sort of position, and it's a really interesting line. You get some really complicated positions. I had a game quite recently, in fact, where we reached this sort of similar looking position, and you know, we were throwing just the kitchen sink against each other, and I didn't expect this from a French exchange. You know, you normally would have this sort of calm position, but this is probably the only bit in the French exchange where you're going to get these quite violent positions. So white seeing that black has castled queen side, will now start throwing stuff down black's throat. So this is a typical move that you'll see in this variation. So this b4 idea. So just pouncing on black's decision to castle on the queen side. G5, bishop G3, H5. I'll just show you some of these interesting looking moves. So yeah, this is interesting. It's saying, according to the end, if I'm looking at the engine analysis, it's giving white a slight edge here. But nonetheless, this is just absolutely fascinating to look at. You know, black is going to be trying to throw his stuff down, meanwhile white is going to try and throw his stuff down. I've seen a few games. In fact, I think I saw a Nigel Short game where the knight came back to b8 to then try and defend the position this way. I've seen some other games where the knight's come over here and literally black just abandons all defense and just goes in for the kill against white. Some absolutely fascinating positions from that though, so have a look at that in your own time. Going back, a little bit of a safer way to play here is after castles. Oh, if I could just go back one moment. If you don't want to play in such a audacious way, castles and then just castles this side is pretty good as well. You can still actually, after bishop to g5, so pinning this knight, you can still play f6 here. White's going to have a tough time trying to exploit this light square weakness, although he's got ideas like this maybe. So maybe I'm just talking nonsense here actually. Yeah, it's interesting anyway. Bishop to come into h4, bishop to f5, e1, queen to d7. So similar ways that we're developing our pieces here. Yeah, and just keep everything together. You know, you've got this sort of exchanges here. There's a game that I'll be sort of following in this. It's about in this sort of position. I think it's in the Masters game. Have a look at it again in your own time. It was between Zed Zan and D Polinza, which I've completely mispronounced their names, but essentially from here there's a really interesting endgame. Black gets a nice edge from this position and gets a very good endgame position from this. So that's really it with the exchange variations. So those are the kind of the two main ideas that you're going to face against. As I say, it's a very difficult position to play against. For me, you're going to see this. Well, I'll just say on a personal level, you'll see this a lot on online games. So do make sure you know the lines well and what to do against the two various responses. But otherwise, you know, you just look to develop normally. Is a sort of an easy strategy to playing against this. You kind of calm in the fact that you have kind of equalized by move 3. So you know, maybe if you just develop your pieces normally, you're not going to get in too much danger, as white isn't going to really be flipping the table in front of you and throwing the kitchen sink at you. Maybe in the Monte Carlo there is a little bit more worry for black in terms of the space advantage that white will receive in this position, but actually for the most part it's relatively harmless, this position. And just looking at the database here, black scores relatively well. Although white is winning sort of 34% of his games, black is winning about 26. So it's not, and there's about sort of 40% drawing here as well. So there's not, you know, as many wins for white in this position as one would think. And again, with the exchange variation from this position, funnily enough, there's I mean, it's crazy to think in some lines there's an 81% chance of drawing, but a clear advantage for black. Black is winning a lot more games here. So definitely look into this variation. As I say, the key idea is just develop normally. Don't worry too much about what white is doing when you're playing against the exchange variation. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video. So in the next part we'll look at probably the final most important variation, and that is the King's Indian attack. Alright, thank you very much. Take care. Bye bye.